Welcome to the Land in the Bible podcast. We are here today, which is, if you think about it, it's pretty deep.
That we're here today?
Yeah, we're here. We're here right now.
That's true.
So, what are we getting into? I'm going to answer my own question because I know what we're getting into. We're getting into Matthew 8, and we're talking about Jesus, and he's in Galilee, and he's doing ministry and all that stuff.
Yeah, so Matthew 8 and a little bit over into Matthew 9.
Okay.
And we're looking at a series of healings that Matthew thought it was important to record. Mm-hmm. And we're going to figure out, with all the thousands and thousands of people that Jesus healed over the course of his years of ministry, why did Matthew think we really need to know about these, that these were important ones to put out there for eternity for us all to know about. So that's the general direction we're going in.
Cool. So, this has been a part of the Jesus Galilean ministry series that we're in, and we have a few more to do, I guess, in this, and it's been really good. So I'm excited to get into it. So are we starting at the beginning of Matthew 8? What are we?
Matthew 8, the very beginning.
Okay, cool.
So, and this is kind of where it goes. So this is like literally right after he finishes the Sermon on the Mount. So he's done speaking and he's walking back into town. Okay, there's been no gap. There's been no, pause. So Matthew 5, 6, and 7, it's a long sermon, a long speech with a huge crowd of people. He finishes, and it says, when he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Now, we don't know. You get a lot of these words in the Bible that that are subjective. That Jesus was buried close by where he was executed.
Yeah.
Well, what is close by? Close by is very different.
And how much of that stuff is like translation because of the Greek?
Yeah, but close. But okay. Well, that gets into a whole different
maybe
concept that I wasn't even going to go into. But
yeah.
But in general, what you have to know regarding how Eastern people think and how Western people think is that in general, measures of like space, time, and distance in the East were subjective, and in the West they were objective, going way, way, way back in time. So Romans had mile markers on roads. And going back to the BC, 500 BC, they were putting measuring perfectly and putting mile markers down. Whereas anything in Eastern literature will say like, oh, this was 2 days journey. Like, who knows what 2 days journey is? Like, we have no idea what that means. 2 days journey on what? On a donkey, on foot, on a camel? Is it up and down hill, so it would be shorter? Is it rougher terrain? Like, you have no idea what that means. Measures of time, the third watch, things like this. Later Islam would divide the day up by prayers, first, second, third, fourth, fifth prayer. Well, when the sun's here, when the sun's there, whatever. The Greeks were making accurate water clocks, again, in the BC period. In Europe, by 1400, there were public clocks in every town square, little tiny towns that would ring on the hour so people get to work on time. That's important to Western people. The first public clock in the East was installed in Istanbul, Constantinople, in the late 1800s, hundreds of years later to get the first clock because just nobody cared.
So I think you told me when I came one time out to film with you in the West Bank, where you lived and all that stuff, you said, well, things are, I said, what time are we going to film? And what time is your basketball game? I think you were coaching basketball and we were going to film some B-roll.
Yeah.
And you're like, what time's the game? You're like, well, it's kind of time. It's a little different. Time's a little different here. And you're like, here, something doesn't happen unless it happened. And even then it might not have happened.
Yeah. Well, just time means nothing. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and get a shower, make dinner. Maybe you'll show up.
I have another question kind of about, I don't want to get off topic because I know you got to get into this, but as we're reading, this is kind of like a cultural thing about how the Gospels were written. And as we're reading this, what we should focus on, a lot of times because of the way the things you were talking about, like the details and the time and the lists, we think very much logically.
Yeah.
Do we focus on details that they weren't meant for us to necessarily focus on because it's not the point of the story? Do we do that a lot?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Or just sometimes, you have certain numbers or things that are stated which don't necessarily mean that number. They just mean a concept. So like when Jesus says forgive 70 times 7, that doesn't mean to well, that's 492 times I've forgiven you, so we're done, Like it just means keep forgiving, or he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. That doesn't mean that the cattle on hill 1003 aren't his. That just means he owns all the cattle,
But we sometimes read the text that way.
Yeah, it doesn't. That's not how. Oftentimes when
I say we. I'm not saying like scholars.
As Westerners. But I would say we do the same things linguistically. So it's weird that we do that, right? So you may go to pick up your baby and say oh, he weighs a ton now. You don't mean he weighs 2,000 pounds. You mean he's heavy, So yeah, I think there are times we put stress on the text. It's not meant to be there, So like when he says a large crowd followed him, what was a large crowd in 30 AD in Matthew's estimation?
Yeah.
I would say it's at least hundreds of people, and maybe it was thousands of people. My intuition is probably thousands. Mm-hmm. So by this point, Jesus is a big deal, and he's coming down the hill. And it says right away, a man with leprosy came up and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." All right, so we unpack that a little bit. Let me talk about leprosy. So leprosy is a communicable disease. You can catch it. It is no longer a threat to us in the modern world because it's bacterial. We have a cure for it now. But the last leper colony in America was only closed, I think, in maybe the 80s or 90s. It was fairly recent that we had leprosariums or whatever, like leper colonies, in places like Hawaii and Louisiana, different places in America, until very recent years. And in parts of the world where they don't have modern medicine, they still exist. And basically, leprosy is a disease of the skin, but particularly the nerves, and you lose the ability to feel pain. And so what typically happens is you break or cut or burn parts of your body and you don't know it. So you've broken a toe or you've cut your finger and you just keep using it. And then that causes compounding problems. Eventually you end up losing, your toe falls off or your finger. And eventually it gets beyond that to, serious infection. Eventually it goes into eyes and nose. And its advanced stages, you have all these sort of skin sores and things start falling off. And it's a very repulsive, disgusting. If you ever see pictures of people with late stage leprosy, it is truly repulsive. And it is a disease of the skin, which the Torah, the law of Moses, had clearly stated that they were supposed to avoid people that had those kind of issues. And that was done for cleanliness reasons, that they didn't want people to, it was transmissible. So if I touch you and you've got it, then I might get it. And I don't want that because it's awful. And so anyone who had leprosy was put out of the city. Typically they would live in the outskirts of the town or out of the town, like in the woods and the edge of, because, cities were typically walled in those days, they had very limited, it wasn't like a modern big city like Atlanta or Houston where it's like, you don't really know when you've left it exactly. Like you knew when you had left town, and the people were put outside of it to live in caves or whatever, holes or whatever they could fend for themselves. And their families would maybe bring them food and set it out for them, but they would never have meaningful human interaction from that point on, because no one wanted to risk getting what they had. And it's understandable. So to get leprosy wasn't just to be sick. It was to be completely, utterly outcast. In our society in the last 2 years, we have had a little bit of a reintroduction to being afraid of sick people. That wasn't really a part of our culture, I don't think, for most of my life. But in the last couple of years, due to COVID, I've had just in the last
immediately
few weeks,
what came to mind when you were saying this, and I was just like, that first year when you get to the end of that year and everyone's like, okay, I think we can go on vacation again, and then you do. And then you're like, someone gets COVID, and it's like, whose fault was it? Or whatever.
We're gonna blame somebody. Well,
yeah,
and maybe you've had things like this. I know I have. Just a couple of weeks ago, I think, or 2 or 3 weeks ago. Like I'm sitting in church and I got a cough, and it's like, coughing in public is like, it's like the whole world is going to look like, oh, what do you get? It's like the worst thing. So, before, for most of my life, if, you're going through your day, you cough or sneeze, you just coughed or sneezed and moved on and nobody cared. But now it's like you cough or sneeze and people are like, back, it's sort of the same kind of reaction, like, get away, I don't want it. And that's what it was like. It was a whole life of that. It was a whole life of get away from me, don't get near me. And just huge isolation. And so just hear what Jesus did. And then we're going to go through these, hit them all, and then go back and draw some common threads. So this is what it says. He says, reaching out his hand, Jesus touched him, saying, I am willing, be made clean. Immediately, his leprosy was cleansed. Then Jesus told him, see that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So Jesus reaches out, touches him, heals him, totally revolutionizes the man's life in a minute. Okay? It's a big deal. And then it rolls on from there. Same day. Okay? It says when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him. Now, what you have to understand about the culture in the society at the time was that Judea, which is the area around Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, the southern sort of half of what we call Israel today, that area was, again, referred to was the province of Judea, and it was almost exclusively homogeneously Jewish. There were not very many non-Jews who lived there. But Galilee, the northern sort of half, if you would say, or a third of the country, was very, very mixed. Okay, so much so that it's a couple of places referred to in Scripture as Galilee of the Gentiles. Because even though it was, historically going back to David and Solomon and Joshua, a part of Israel, it had been heavily occupied, colonized, settled, whatever you want to say, by other kinds of people. There were Greeks there and Romans there and Phoenicians there and Sidonians there, and on and on and on with sort of the list of people groups that were in that area at the time. So it was a very, very mixed population. There were Jewish cities, but there were also other kinds of cities. And within a city, you may have different kinds of people moving around. So clearly in Capernaum, which is a lovely lakeside city on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, you had some Roman representation there, and you had soldiers there just to keep an eye on things, obviously. So Jesus is entering the town now. So he heals the leper coming down from the hill. He's going to enter the town, and a centurion comes up. Now, what you've got to know, we think in modern America that we have a very particular, unique issue with racism. And we do have an issue with racism. But the reality is it is in no way unique in the history of the world. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the absence of racism would be unique in the history of the world, that there have always been divisions between racial and ethnic groups, that there have always been, like, that people always sort of enjoy homogenous groups. That's more comfortable, that's easier. And people always have an in-group preference. You tend to like yours and not like theirs. That's the nature of what humans do. And much of what Jesus came to do was to maybe break some of that down, was to kind of get beyond that. And you see a little bit of that in this story. So this Roman who Jews hate Romans. It's just a general assumption. Later in Acts, when the first true Roman, he's not, early on you have some Greek Jews who get saved and become a part of the church, but they're still Jews, But the first fully, totally foreign, no Jewish blood at all, Roman gets saved, Cornelius. Peter is shocked. And he goes back and he tells the apostles and the leaders of the church in Jerusalem what happened. And they're like, you did what? Who got saved? You went in his house? And they're shocked that Peter would even speak to a Roman, that he would go in a Roman home, that they can get saved. The Lord likes them. Really? And so you've got to know there is a deep animosity here between the Jews and the Romans. That the Jewish people, by and large, really, really don't like the Romans. Well, you know why don't they like them? They don't like them because they conquered Israel. They occupied the country. You know, they were very heavy-handed and oppressive in that conquest. They taxed people like crazy. Now, the Romans were very adept at using both sort of the carrot and the stick. You know, so sometimes they were actually kind of good occupiers. They would come in, build you new roads and aqueducts and cities, and integrate you into their economy. And so some people actually really liked being a part of the empire, actually. But for the Jews, because of some of their religious peculiarities and they never did well, and eventually would revolt. 30 years after this, they would revolt against the Romans, or 40 years later. And so they never sat well with them. They never liked it. They viewed it as being trampled upon. They were it hurt their dignity to be occupied like that. It never went well there. And so there's a hatred because of that. Also, they just looked at Romans as being gross. And paganism was gross. Generally speaking, pagan worship involved lots of sexual immorality. Temple prostitution was normal. It also involved lots of just blood and gore. Now, that adds to Judaism, frankly, because you're doing sacrifices, you're, killing animals on an altar. So, that happened in both. Romans ate things that Jews thought were gross. Jews had dietary laws, and they ate certain foods they viewed as clean. Romans are eating all sorts of gross things out of the water, and pigs, and whatever, and things that had blood in them, and so there were all sorts of reasons between their gods and their sexual practices and their eating, and Jews just kind of viewed Romans with contempt, like they were disgusting. Well, the Romans reciprocated that hatred, because if somebody looks down on you, you can look down on them too. And so the Romans thought the Jews were lazy, and that Jews were obstinate and difficult, and so there was just all this stuff, angst. And later Paul would call it the dividing wall of hostility between Jews and the Greeks and Romans. And Jesus wanted to end that. So all that's in the background. All these Jews are with Jesus and him trying to become his followers. They think he might be the Messiah, and then up comes this Roman, and you can imagine everybody's like, ugh. Probably scared of him because he's a soldier, but also hate his guts. And the centurion says, "Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed in terrible agony." And Jesus said to him, "Am I to come and heal him?" Okay, let's just pause that. Something else you have to know about Romans is that Roman culture was incredibly, incredibly classed. Okay, American culture is we have classes, like we have, middle class and upper middle class, right, and upper class and lower class. We have different stratas of wealth and, privilege, if you want to use that word or whatever. That's true. We have that. But in American culture, it's fluid. You can go from being poor to being rich. You can go from being average to rich. You can also be rich to being poor, in American culture. And there's lots of stories on both sides of that. So our classes are a bit fluid. Their classes weren't. It was pretty fixed. Above and beyond that, at least 25% of the Roman citizens, of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were slaves. Slaves everywhere. And generally speaking, because we view everything through our lens. And even if you're secular in the West, for 2,000 years, you've heard things like the first shall be last. You've heard things like do unto others as you would have to do unto you. You've heard things, like what you do unto the least of these, do unto me. And all these sort of ideas from Christianity about the value of the poor and the needy and the vulnerable, and how your goodness and godliness is based on how you treat people like that. Greeks and Romans had no such ideas. They, as a rich or powerful person, they felt no sense of obligation to the weak and the needy. So, and there's plenty of ways you could verify that. There's plenty of sources, or you could go back and read Aristotle. You could read Cicero. There's plenty of people you could read where that comes through.
And as a historical side note, since that's your background,
a little bit, yeah.
How many other just as just wondering how many other maybe like ancient civilizations or cultures were this way.
All of them?
That's what
I mean, I think so. Pretty much all of them. Like
that was a rhetorical question, but I knew you were. But
yeah, I mean, I don't think you have any now. And I'm open to being corrected on this. Right. I actually love to be corrected on this. I'd like to know the sources.
Right.
But I don't think you have any like abolitionist or anti-slavery literature or writing until early Christians. Paul is somewhat anti-slavery. He says if you can get free, you should. And he talks to owners of slaves and says, hey, that's your brother in Christ, so treat him accordingly. And he begins to put boundaries on slavery, which really make it eventually impossible. Like how can I say that Jesus loves you as much as he loves me and then own you? It doesn't really work. But I think I want to say like Gregorius, maybe somebody like that, around the 300-400s AD, is the first anti-slavery literature in the world that exists, where somebody came out and said, owning a slave is a sin. This is bad. The Christian can't do this, or this is wrong. I just don't think it exists. Like all these ideas. I think we talked about this in earlier episodes. But the way Romans did conquest was they would go into a city, kill. I mean, when Julius Caesar goes into Gaul, he kills millions of people, hauls millions of other people back as slaves, and is proud of it. He parades the slaves through the streets of the city. He brings their king back. Parades Vercingetorix, whatever his name was, parades him through the city. He's Julius Caesar is in his chariot with Vercingetorix on the floor, and his foot is on his head, on his neck.
Right.
Then they get to the forum and he chops his head off in front of the crowd. And everybody's like, "Ah, yeah, we're the strongest. Mm-hmm. Our strength is awesome. We can dominate these people." And that's just how it worked. The strong can dominate, and that's how it is. We're proud of our strength. We work hard to be strong. If you've seen like movies like 300 or something like that, which are obviously very Hollywood and a little bit comical.
Yeah.
But they still communicate like the spirit of a place like Sparta.
I just assumed everyone had abs back then.
Yeah.
That's what I gained from that
And they fought
movie.
in nothing but loincloths. Yeah, because that was smart. So, but that spirit of like, we're going to take you as a 5-year-old and just beat you half to death to make you tough and hardened, because all that matters is being strong, so we can keep the slaves oppressed and we can go conquer and defend. Like that was how things worked. And if you were too weak to carry a shield and a spear, well then too bad, and you were relegated to the back end of society. So things didn't go well for you, So in the context of that sort of culture, this guy is an interesting person because he cares enough about his slave, his servant, who's hurting and in pain, to go seek out a Jew who they don't typically like to heal. And he refers to this Jew, to Jesus, as Lord. So this guy, there's something special there. There's something that's just not normal for a Roman soldier. So we don't know to exactly what extent this guy.
So he was already kind of like following a little bit, kind of like seeing what was going on.
It could be. We have there's a whole classification of people the Bible refers to as God-fearers, which were Roman or Greek people who had come to believe in the God of Abraham, and they wanted to follow and worship him, but they weren't ready to get circumcised and follow Jewish dietary laws and convert to Judaism. But they would hang around synagogues. They would learn about God, and they revered the one true God of Abraham as God. So they, again, God-fearers. They fear God. They pray to him. But they weren't totally all in on become converted to Judaism. Understandably so. I wouldn't either. So maybe he's one of those kind of guys. Certainly he has a heart of kindness and compassion for those in his household and those under him. So it seems a good guy. It seems he has a heart for the Lord, or a heart for his people, which so that you immediately sort of identify with this guy. You're like, all right, this guy's a little different. He's reaching across the boundaries, and so Jesus says, am I to come heal him? So Jesus at that point is also touching a boundary because Jews did not enter Roman homes. It was considered a sin to even cross the threshold in their home because there was so much sin in a Roman household. Between the again, we already talked about the food, sexuality, all kinds. That's a dirty, sinful place. Jesus says, "Should I come?" And it's like, whoa, you're going place like Jews don't do that. This is weird stuff you're talking about already. And the centurion knows the rules too, so he's like, you don't have to do that. He says, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, having soldiers under my command. I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it." It's like, I understand what this guy's saying. I think this is not really the main point of what I want to talk about today, but it's so I can't just pass it up either. This guy's understanding of where authority comes from is brilliant. Like, he doesn't say, I'm a boss because I'm a boss. He says, I'm under authority, therefore I can say, go and come and do. People have to do it. So my authority doesn't come from me. It comes from my upstream structure above me. Okay? And so the best example of this that I can think of is imagine the smallest, puniest, weakest, tiniest police officer in the, like a guy that's just, he's not going to win a fight.
Okay.
I'm
thinking like back to watching Police Academy in the 80s, seeing if I've got, remember that movie?
Oh yeah. Way back when they made the sounds and all that.
Sounds. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's not him, but there definitely was like a puny guy in there. I think I got it.
Okay.
There. All right.
So imagine that guy, and for whatever reason, he's on some sort of been assigned to do this, whatever. He steps out in the road to stop a big giant, 18-wheeler, this huge truck that weighs thousands and thousands of pounds. And he's like, and this giant truck going 70 miles an hour stops. Why? He's not strong enough to stop a truck. He's not strong enough to beat up the driver. He's a little guy. Nothing about him makes the truck stop. The truck stops because he has a police car and he has a badge. And what that means is that he does not represent himself, but the government of Georgia or Tennessee or California or wherever he is. And if that truck carries on and ignores him, then the entire might of the state, of the government, will come down on that man's head. And if that truck driver were to run that cop over or to physically assault him, then they will really come down on his head, and he'll spend the rest of his life in a jail cell. So the truck stops. The man has authority because he's under authority. And this Roman gets that. Like a lot of times I think, like especially when we're young and immature, we just want to rebel, just be like, I'm the boss, whatever. It's like, no, like you have authority when you're in a power structure. That's when you're actually strongest. And of course, spiritually, the implication is that you have some level of spiritual authority. Your prayers have effect over your family and your life, and you're more effective when you're under authority. So because you're under Christ and you're under the Father, then what you say and do matters. Right. As a rebel, like, who are you?
Right.
You're just gonna get trucked. And this guy gets all of that at a spiritual level because he's saying to Jesus, I know that you're operating under the authority of the Father, so you can just say, be healed, and my servant will be healed. You don't have to go anywhere. And like, how did he, because this is very early in Jesus' ministry, how this man had made such a jump, spiritually, intellectually, is really interesting. It's like, how did this guy know that? Or deduce all that?
Jesus, we're going to get to it, but Jesus is amazed.
Yeah.
So,
oh, yeah. Yeah.
I just look down and it says, when he heard this. He was amazed.
Yeah,
So
he's like, whoa.
we should probably also be amazed if it amazed Jesus.
Yeah, he was just like, and Jesus looks at the crowd and says, truly, I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great a faith. He's like looking at this crowd full of people, which would probably mostly Jews. And he's like, none of them figured this stuff out. And they have all these scriptures and the Torah and the knowledge and the history and the culture that leads them to, like, wow. And he said, I tell you that many will come from the east and the west to share the banquet with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is really, again, starting to say, like, hey, my, ecclesia, my gathering, my community of followers that I'm going to build is going to be a lot bigger than maybe what people are thinking, But he says, but sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus told the centurion, go, as you have believed, let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that very moment. Okay, so Jesus is like, you're awesome. That's amazing. By the way, lots of your people are going to get saved. And a lot of these people aren't. It's basically what he says in front of this crowd. They're like, you can imagine the reaction to that, as he starts to cross, again, some racial lines here, cultural lines. Okay, so that happens. Then we roll on. Luke 4 tells us the exact same story, but it expands it a bit. I'm sorry, Luke 8. And here's what you get. It says, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were expecting him. Just then, a man named Jairus came. He was a leader of the synagogue. Okay, so this guy, so Jesus has just healed someone who's in the Roman leadership structure. Now you get somebody who's in the Jewish leadership structure. And this guy comes and fell down at Jesus' feet and pleaded with him to come to his house because he had an only daughter about 12 years old and she was dying. And so this is really interesting because, the Jewish leadership structure, the religious structure, the Pharisees, and this guy was, a leader at the synagogue. So you're pretty safe to assume he's a Pharisee, were constantly sparring with Jesus. They didn't necessarily like him that much, though many of them eventually did come to faith, by the way. But, he's constantly in tension with these people. They don't like him. They don't like his authority. But this guy's daughter gets sick and he knows where to go. He's like, oh, well, I didn't necessarily like Jesus too much, but, my family's in line. I know where to go. And maybe there's something to be learned there.
I was about to say. That's something to marinate on, maybe.
Yeah. That you like him or not, when the chips are down, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
And that goes throughout the Bible, by the way. Like I always think about Daniel with the writing on the wall. That they didn't like Daniel at all. But when a weird hand appeared on the wall, they're like, yeah, go get Daniel.
Get that guy.
Yeah. So I think sometimes doing right, you've earned people's respect even if they don't like you, and when the chips are down, they'll come find you. Because all their dumb friends that they do dumb things with, that they're more fun to hang out with. But when push comes to shove, they're going to be like, he's got it together. He knows that's where I should go. And there's probably something to aspire to in that. Not just kind of going along to get along, to be like just one more of the crowd, but sometimes you stand out. And that's not always easy, but people know. They and I think they respect it. And obviously Jesus had the power that this guy needed to access. So he goes to Jesus. And he says, while he was going, the crowds were nearly crushing him. A woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years, who had spent all she had on doctors and yet could not be healed by any, approached him from behind and touched the end of his robe. Instantly, her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. And when they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the crowds are hemming you in and pressing against you. Someone did touch me, said Jesus. I know that power has gone out from me. And when the woman saw that she was discovered, she came trembling and fell down before him in the presence of all the people. She declared the reason she had touched him and how she was instantly healed. Daughter, he said to you, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. All right. So I want to unpack this one a little bit. So, older translations will say she had an issue of blood. The translation I'm using right now, I think it's the CSB, is just a little more blunt. It just says she suffered from bleeding.
Yeah.
Okay, so she has a menstrual issue. And we hear that and we think, well, obviously that would be unpleasant, would be bad as a male. I can't exactly go too far down that road.
Right.
But, that's not good. But if you don't know what the Bible says in the Old Testament, the culture that she's living in, then you don't have any concept of what that means. But if you flip over and look at Leviticus 15, you get a glimpse into what this did mean for somebody at that time. I'll give a little warning here if you're like listening with kids or something and you don't want to hear blunt stuff about medical issues, then I don't know.
Parent advisory.
Yeah, parent advisory, Leviticus upcoming. So we're going to talk about discharges. But so this is what Leviticus 15, 19 through 24 says. It says, when a woman has a discharge and it consists of blood from her body, she will be unclean because of her menstruation for 7 days. Okay, so you get that. If there's bleeding that day and then for 7 days following, you are unclean. But get the extent of that. Everyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Anything she lies on during her menstruation will become unclean. Anything she sits on will become unclean. Okay, it's not just her, it's anything she touches. So if you touch what she touched, it's like it's catching. Okay? Everyone who touches her bed is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. Everyone who touches any furniture she was sitting on is to wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will remain unclean until evening. If discharge is on the bed or the furniture she was sitting on, when he touches it, he will be unclean until evening. If a man sleeps with her and blood from her menstruation gets on him, he will be unclean for 7 days, and every bed he lies on will become unclean. Okay, and it even goes on from there. So the point is, in this culture that was following these rules, this was an absolute nightmare. Okay?
Right.
It meant everything she ever touched was considered ceremonially unclean and dirty, and whoever touched that was considered ceremonially unclean and dirty and had to go through a process of bathing himself and washing their clothes, and they were still unclean until night. Okay? And so what this means is this woman had been living where she had to only sit on the things she sat on and only touch the things she touched. And not only could no one ever touch her, they couldn't even touch the stuff she touched for 12 years. So in addition to whatever was wrong in her physically, whatever was doing to her body, the social implications were horrific. This woman had not had normal human interaction and affection and kindness. She couldn't touch her husband, couldn't touch her kids for 12 years. Okay? Now, just so you'll know, this is sort of a cultural side note. These rules are still followed. And
I think we talked about that on previous episodes, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. About how certain communities, like it's known, and you'll see ladies come into stores and they'll kind of put their hands up, and that means like, don't touch me. Mm-hmm. So they're letting everybody know. Yeah. And it's common knowledge in ultra Orthodox communities. The rabbis. It's very strange, like for Westerners. Yeah. But the rabbis know the schedules of all the women in their congregation and who shouldn't be there, what weeks and things like that. Like it's it's odd, for us that to know that, these cycles of every woman in the community is just like absolute public knowledge to everybody. Yeah. But it is, it's absolutely that way. And it has all sorts of strange implications in the society. One of them, what this is designed to do. Okay. So I don't know, this is a side note, and really, my earlier warning regarding the kids, what it is designed to do is that you cannot touch your wife for the days she's menstruating or the 7 days after. So it's basically half the month. You literally cannot touch your wife. Also, you're not supposed to have marital interactions on Shabbat, which is kind of Friday, Saturday. So you add it all up. There's only about 10 days a month that you have legal physical access to your wife, let's say. Well, it just so happens that when you're allowed to touch your wife, exactly coincides with when a woman ovulates. And so the system is designed to make lots of babies.
Interesting.
And so you see ultra-Orthodox Jewish families, and they all have 10, 12, they all have a truck ton of kids, because the whole system is set up where, the guy sort of spends 2 weeks waiting, and then all of a sudden it's like green light, go, and they have sex, and then they just make lots and lots and lots of babies.
Right.
It's designed, and okay, so that's what you've created.
Yeah.
But it has some strange things, So how I'll share. We can cut this out if we want to later. I'll share it and you decide. But ultra-Orthodox Jewish weddings, it is required. It is incumbent upon the husband and bride to consummate the marriage on the night of the wedding. It is also against the rules to have, to consummate the marriage during the 14 days or so when you're not, when the woman is quote unquote unclean, biblically speaking. So the girl in a religious wedding has to go and have her cycle verified by the wife of the rabbi. And, they verify when she's good, when she's not good, and schedule the wedding accordingly. She can't schedule the wedding certain times of the month. So you have to plan. It creates all sorts of oddities in planning of weddings and parties and things like this, which we never would think of.
Yeah.
So her situation was complicated.
So that's kind of the cultural context for what's going on here.
Well, and it's specifically why does it say about 4 times in there, did you touch me? Who touched me? Because her touching his clothes, which is touching him, indirectly, right? Because anything she touches is right. If she touches it, now you're dirty too. Mm-hmm. Which is why she's trembling. Why is she scared? Because she has this problem and she's touched him, which is now makes him unclean. So he's supposed to go do this whole process, which is a pain and annoying to him, and messes up his day or whatever.
Right.
So that's why she's like, and any religious authority she had ever dealt with her entire life would have been angry at her in that moment. What have you done? You know the rules, and you did this, and And so she expects the same reaction, but Jesus says, you're healed, go. God bless you. It's a totally different reaction than the culture would normally expect. Okay? So there's that. And what's interesting is Jesus is on his way. You've got to think, he's got Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. So this is one of the top ranking Jews in the whole city, from a human perspective, you might think, oh, it's a big deal for Jesus if he gets in with Jairus, I mean, obviously that's not true, but, as humans think, you would think that. Jesus doesn't think that at all. Jairus' daughter is dying, and he stops to deal with this woman who's an outcast. So, yeah, so it's sort of sandwiched in the story in that you have Jairus who's put on pause while Jesus goes to deal with this woman who's an outcast. He deals with that, and then it jumps back into the Jairus issue, right? And it says, while he was still speaking, someone from the synagogue leader's house came and said, your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. When Jesus heard it, he answered him, don't be afraid. Only believe, and she will be saved. And after he came to the house, he let no one enter with him except Peter, John, James, and the child's father and mother. Everyone was crying and mourning for her, but he said, stop crying, because she's not dead, but asleep. Now, people back then knew good and well when somebody was dead.
So it wasn't like, I'm not quite dead yet.
No,
wasn't that.
and also just at a sort of an apologetics level, because some people think like, oh,
Right.
one of the things about Jesus' resurrection is like he wasn't really dead.
Yeah.
They didn't know, they didn't have proper modern medicine, so maybe he was just like
I'm like,
almost dead, but not quite.
right.
And the way you heal somebody is you seal them up in a tomb and then they get better.
Yeah.
It makes no
So
sense
it's not
whatsoever.
like it's not like Princess Bride. Like where it's like
No.
he's mostly dead.
No. They knew good and well when somebody was dead back then. So it goes on to say that they're all crying and they laugh at Jesus. Like, what are you talking about? She's dead. She's full dead, because they knew, it even says, because they knew she was dead. So he took her by the hand and called out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned. She got up at once. Then he gave orders that she be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. Now, what I want to point out in closing, okay, is to think through why. It's really in one running account in Matthew 8 and 9. Of course, Luke retells it himself. Why did Matthew and then Luke also think these are the healings you need to know about? Jesus healed thousands of people. He healed people daily. It says that he brought them all their sick and he healed them all. And we only know of 40 or 50 days, 50 or 60 days, I think, of his ministry are recorded. But he ministered 365 days a year, times at least 3. So there's way more that we don't know about than we do know about. Why did these guys, in thinking about Jesus and his life and his story, think you need to know about this? And I think it is because these healings, not only do they just illustrate the fact that Jesus could heal people and had supernatural power or whatever. Okay, we know that. But I think that they let us into something else that's going on. And as we already kind of hinted at regarding the woman with the issue of blood, there was an issue in Judaism regarding cleanness and uncleanness. Okay? Not only were women certain times of the month considered unclean, but so were dead bodies. So were lepers. Okay? And so were foreigners, frankly. And so what you see in Jesus throughout all of these, and also what you have to know is the way that Jews stayed clean was by avoiding that which was unclean. Okay? Now, obviously, somebody had to bury the bodies, but when you did that, then you're unclean. The whole process you have to go through to be restored to being able to function, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
It's kind of the Good Samaritan parable we did.
Yes, this guy's bleeding.
Yeah.
He has blood coming out of his body.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Right.
Can't touch that.
They're going around. They're avoiding. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so in a place where you've been taught your whole life that the way you stay clean is to avoid that which is unclean, which frankly is how we often do it. Right. And I'm not trying to advocate for as a Christian, you should find the dirtiest, nastiest place you should go and run, I'm not saying I don't know what, find brothels and strip clubs and run in there and, just be like, it's clean now because I'm here. It's not what I'm saying. I understand human wisdom. Mm-hmm. But Jesus models something very, very different. Jesus says through these healings, when I touch that which is unclean, it doesn't make me dirty. It makes it clean. Okay? So the influencer and the influencee, who's being changed by the interaction, normally you touch something dirty, now you're dirty. Jesus is like, no, I fix it. I don't get dirty. I don't get corrupted. I'm the affecting agent. I'm the agent of change. I go into places that are unclean, unholy, unhealthy, aren't working, aren't functioning, and I change them and make them alive and healthy. And I think as Christians that should be the effect that we have. It shouldn't be, again, with human wisdom, with wisdom, okay, not human wisdom, with godly wisdom. With wisdom, obviously you don't go participate in sin. But you should, Jesus, the Bible says he put flesh in the Word of God. He dwelt among, the Word became flesh. He dwelled among men, and they saw his glory. That his methodology for impacting the world was put flesh in the Word of God to live in a godly way, according with the Word, and dwell among men, be among people, and then they'll see the glory in that. And we should be doing the same. We should try to put flesh on his words, be among people, and let them see the glory, not our glory, it's reflected. We don't have glory of our own, but to see the glory of a life lived accordingly. And I think if we do that, then we become agents of change and a source of life. If the Holy Spirit is in us, and the Holy Spirit has the power to heal and to fix and to change, then that's what we should do. We shouldn't exist in like holy bubbles, scared of the world and talking about how dirty and bad it is. It is dirty and bad. Leprosy is dirty and bad. That woman's health problem, I'm sure she didn't like it. The Romans were gross. Death is death. Okay, none of the they're no way minimizing any of those things. They were bad. They were problems. But if you have the solution, shouldn't you get it there? So I think it's a model for us. Is the fact that we need to think about, how can we be the source of light and life and change to those darkened places, not just run away from them and hide and be scared by them. So anyway, that's sort of the big thought for today's episode.
Yeah, that's good. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate this one. It was really, I know we got into some like other stuff, which is always fun to kind of like get into some dialogue about culture and different things. And
I like rabbit trails too much.
Yeah. But, I think that's great. As always, for more content, check us out on thelandandthebible.com. And, if you want, you can subscribe there for premium content. Check us out everywhere that you can search for us. And, we hope to chat with you sometime.
Like, subscribe, all the good things.
All that stuff. And we'll see you later.